So finally, we're going to talk about adolescent cognitive development. Now, while puberty is wreaking havoc on the body, there are also major changes going on in the brain. There's continued pruning of unused synapses in the cerebral cortex, particularly the prefrontal cortex, and an overall expansion of synaptic connections. We'll start to see stronger connections among various brain regions, particularly links between the prefrontal cortex and the inner brain, including the amygdala and hippocampus. All of this together results in major gains in executive function, reasoning, problem solving, and decision making. But advances aren't sudden. It's not like the adolescent wakes up one day and is much better at these tasks. These changes happen slowly throughout the teenage years. And we start to see an interesting phenomenon where the systems sensitive to risk and reward develop faster than those involved in inhibition, planning, and delay of gratification, which still remain immature. In other words, changes in emotional and social networks outpace the development of cognitive control networks, resulting in self regulation difficulties such as stronger responses to excitatory neurotransmitters, increased reactivity to stress and to pleasurable stimuli, and an unchecked drive for novelty. This is known as dual systems theory, where the two systems within the adolescent brain are sort of out of balance with one another. So I want to show you a short video. This is Dr. Larry Steinberg, who I mentioned earlier, and his lab actually is at Temple University, which is where I received my degree. They do some really interesting work in adolescent development. So let's take a look.
If you're interested in how people get to be the way they are, adolescence is such an important time. We really become the person that we're going to be probably for the rest of our lives. I'm a developmental psychologist. I specialize in adolescence. So I teach and do research on the second decade of the lifespan. And my research right now focuses on how adolescents make decisions, especially in terms of how they make decisions about risk taking. The systems of the brain that respond to reward become very easily aroused. So things that feel good feel even better. And for that reason, people are very attracted to go after rewarding experiences, even if they might be a little bit dangerous. So that kind of impels kids toward risky behaviors. A lot of my interest in adolescent risk taking and decision making grew out of a project I was involved in that looked at juvenile justice policy and practice. And during the last decade, the US Supreme Court has considered three landmark cases involving juvenile crime, probably the most important of which was a case involving the constitutionality of the juvenile death penalty. We were really delighted to see that our work was cited by the court in its opinions that banned the juvenile death penalty and that placed limits on the use of life without parole as a sentence for juveniles. Adolescents are different from adults in ways that make them less responsible for their behavior. They're more impulsive, they're more short-sighted, they're more easily influenced by their peers. So we developed a video driving game that we call Stoplight, where you're trying to get someplace in a hurry, you approach an intersection, the light turns yellow, and you make a decision about whether you're going to try to run it or not. So we can take this task into the MRI and have people play this game while we're capturing brain images. And what we have found is, first, adolescents take many more risks when they're doing this task in front of their friends than when they're doing it by themselves.
I'm good, man. Good luck in there. We're going to be watching you.
But second, when adolescents are doing the driving game, playing stoplight, with their friends watching, parts of their brain that get excited by the prospect of a reward are lighting up. They're being activated. And we have shown that the extent to which the brain lights up during this task predicts how much risk-taking you engage in. So if we could get kids to stop doing things that put themselves in jeopardy, we can really improve the health of American young people.
Anyway, he does some really interesting work. If you're interested and you want to check it out. Okay, come on. Come on, there we go. Okay. And there's quite a bit of evidence for dual systems theory. So what you see here is data from a longitudinal study of a large representative sample of 7,600 United States youth, representing the two dueling systems. So the hot emotional system and the cool cognitive control network. So we see age on the horizontal axis. So impulsivity starts out pretty high and declines steadily over time. By the time they hit early adulthood, they've really developed pretty solid impulse control systems. But at the same time, we see sensation seeking behaviors shoot upwards during early adolescence, and they start to diminish, but much more gradually. Findings confirm the challenge that the emotional social network poses to the cognitive control network. So, this period where sensation seeking is much higher than impulse control is a problem. Now, adolescents are in what Piaget termed the formal operational stage. This begins at 12 and exists into adulthood. This stage involves the ability to think in an abstract manner by manipulating ideas in their head. So they can do mathematical calculations, they can think creatively, and imagine the outcome of particular actions. Two major features of the formal operational stage are hypothetical deductive reasoning and propositional thought. Hypothetical deductive reasoning is the ability to think scientifically through generating predictions or hypotheses about the world in order to answer questions. The individual will approach a problem on a systematic and organized manner rather than through trial and error, which is what we would have seen in the earlier stages. When confronted with a problem or challenge, the adolescent will first identify a hypothesis and then proceed with testing until they reach an answer. So, unlike concrete operations, which begins with reality or what they know and proceeds from there to possibility, the formal operational stage begins with possibility, just a hypothesis, and then proceeds to reality or testing it. The pendulum task is probably the best known example illustrating hypothetical deductive reasoning. So, adolescents are asked to figure out what makes a pendulum swing faster or slower. And so, what happens is they engage in this hypothetical deductive reasoning by thinking of variables which might possibly affect the speed with which the pendulum swings through the air. Then they isolate and test each variable, as well as testing the variables in combination. So eventually, they will deduce that the weight of the object, the height from which it's released, how forcefully it's pushed, all have no effect on the speed of the pendulum. Only string length ultimately makes a difference. Propositional thought is the adolescent's ability to evaluate the logic of verbal propositions without referring to real world circumstances, compared to children who could only evaluate the logic of statements by comparing them to concrete experiences they've had in the real world. More recently, researchers have begun asking whether formal operational thinking actually appears earlier than Piaget suggested. School age children actually show glimmerings of this formal operational thought, although they're not as good at it as adolescents are. Data also suggests that formal operations may not be universal. There's individual differences in competency, even among adults. Some people are just more formally operational than others. This could be due to practice effects of things like training and context. So, someone who works in a math or science field, which facilitates formal propositional thought, will likely perform better than someone who is an artist. In fact, individuals in tribal and village societies typically do poorly at tasks designed to assess formal operations because they're just not skills that they encounter in their day to day life. While Piaget focused on specific forms of cognitive gains, information processing theorists highlight specific mechanisms involved in understanding cognitive development during adolescence. And they're all intertwined and linked together. Gains in one mechanism promote advances in others. During adolescence, working memory increases, which allows more information to be held in the mind at one time. Unlike a child where something falls out of their brain almost instantly, an adolescent can retain and manipulate more information at a time. They begin to develop inhibition so they can filter out irrelevant stimuli when necessary, and can also distinguish between contexts, allowing them to not engage in a well learned response when it would be irrelevant or inappropriate in the given situation. Okay, so for example, say you come home, the first thing you do every day is you take off your pants and toss them on the floor. All right, nothing wrong with that in general. It's generally much more comfy to be pantless, especially in the summer. So that's your well learned response, it's your routine. But one day you come home and there's a repair person in your house working on your AC. Well, a child might still rip off their pants because they don't know or care that it's inappropriate to do so in the presence of the repair person. But an adolescent has the inhibition to monitor the situation and adjust their behavior accordingly. Attention becomes more selective or focused on relevant information and flexible or better adapted to the changing demands of tasks. Adolescents are much better than children at planning for complex tasks. Oops. You can now engage in activities that require a whole bunch of steps. Say you want to put together a bookshelf, where a child might just start grabbing pieces at random and trying to force them together. An adolescent has the skills to look at the directions, lay out all of the pieces, determine the most effective order for the tasks, and be organized and efficient. Excuse me. Our general life knowledge also increases. Adolescents are, in general, much more familiar with bookshelves and the physics that are needed to hold them together, making it easier to strategize and plan the steps that are needed. The adolescent brain is a hotbed of change and growth, which comes with its challenges. Just as adolescents may struggle with their developing bodies, they may often stumble a bit in their abstract thinking. The development of self consciousness and self focusing often results in a struggle with their ability to reflect on their own thoughts, leading them to think more about themselves than others. And so Piaget thought this was a new form of egocentrism, where adolescents struggle to distinguish their own thinking from the perspectives of others. And his followers, most notably David Elkind, expanded this idea to describe two distorted images of the relation between self and others. The imaginary audience refers to the belief that others are constantly focusing attention on them, scrutinizing their behaviors and appearance. The adolescent feels like they are continually the central topic of interest to an audience, although in fact this is not the case, hence the imaginary. So this imaginary audience helps explain why adolescents fixate so much on their appearance and are so sensitive to public criticism. Sorry to do this to you, but do you remember being in middle school and you got called out for something by the teacher? I remember that happening to me. You're sure that everyone is staring at you. You're just wishing for that hole to open up under your feet and suck you in. But when the same thing happens to someone else, we hardly notice. It's really not that interesting. But when it's us, we're convinced that everyone is watching and judging, and OMG, the world as we know it is over. The other distorted image is a personal fable, which is a belief in one's own uniqueness and invulnerability. Adolescents are sure people are watching them, leading to inflated opinions of their own importance. They think everything is about them. Teenagers are also full of idealism and criticism. Their mindsets have broadened, allowing them to view the world as full of possibilities. The sky is the limit. The problem here is that their over idealistic views of the world, family, and other humans create unrealistic expectations that friends, parents, teachers, and even they themselves can't live up to, causing tension. And finally, teens show major changes in their decision making processes. Perhaps the most obvious is their tendency to seek immediate reward without fully thinking through all the angles, resulting in increased risk taking and some really pretty poor life choices, like what Dr. Steinberg was talking about. For example, adolescents are more enticed than adults by the possibility of instant reward, and accordingly, they're more likely to take risks and avoid losses, like in the stoplight task. And this is particularly apparent when peers are present, perhaps explaining some of the risky behaviors that occur in groups. We know that adolescents are far more likely to engage in these risky behaviors like speeding or drinking or shoplifting when they're in the presence of their friends compared to when they're alone. The beginning of adolescence typically coincides with the transition from elementary into middle school, a time fraught with challenges and changes. Transitioning to a new school often results in a complete disruption of social groups. So sometimes you'll have the same kids as were in elementary school, but depending on district lines, sometimes it's just a hodgepodge of familiar and unfamiliar faces. In addition to the physical challenges we've already discussed, there are substantial cognitive changes going on as well. And we haven't even yet begun to tackle the hot mess of social and emotional changes, which we'll do next week. In terms of cognitive development, we know that grades decline with each transition. So from elementary to middle, and then from middle to high school, we see drops in grades. Some of this is expected. Academic standards become higher. Students are expected to become more independent. There's often a less supportive teaching and learning environment as large classes mean less personal attention. Oftentimes, there are additional consideration for ethnic minority teens in that they have fewer same ethnicity peers in their classes to provide support. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we see a decline in liking for school, academic motivation, and self esteem as students progress from elementary to middle to high school. Teens feel that their teachers care less about them, are less friendly, and grade more harshly as they progress through the grade levels. As always, environmental factors such as poverty, family disruption, and family conflict create additional strains, increasing the risk for self esteem and academic difficulties. Support for adolescents' academic achievement can come from a variety of places. Now, I'll only beat the dead horse a little by saying that supportive and involved parents who utilize authoritative parenting styles and joint decision making often have children who are well adjusted and do well in school. Peers and classmates who value high achievement are also important. So, associating with peers who prioritize school and care about learning has a pretty profound rub off effect. Relatedly, the characteristics of the classroom and school are vital. Warm personal teaching, learning activities that promote high level thinking, and opportunities to break out of low academic tracks can really springboard teens on their way to positive achievement. On the flip side of academic achievement is dropping out of school. 7 to 16% of US teens, 16 to 24-year-olds, I guess that's not teens, end up dropping out of high school with no degree. We've seen declines in the dropout rate since the mid 2000s, but the rates remain high, particularly among those from low SES families. So, what can we do to help keep kids in school? Prevention strategies include small classes, intensive remedial instruction for those at risk, as well as personalized counseling and warm, supportive teacher interactions. In some cases, high quality vocational education is more realistic and effective than formal schooling. Although to work well, they must integrate academics with job related instruction so students are able to see the connection and importance of the in class learning. We can address personal factors related to dropout as well, things like parental involvement, flexible work study arrangements, on site childcare for teenage parents. And finally, drawing students into extracurricular activities can often be an effective motivation to stay in school. This works particularly well for schools that have a fairly small student body and more individual attention. So I want to end by talking about media multitasking. Ever do that thing where you sit down to read, but every time you pick up your book, your phone dings and you pick it up to check? Or say you're watching TV, but you're reading a book at the same time? Who's guilty of that? I know I totally am. Often what happens is I'm watching a movie and playing my emoji game on my phone at the same time. And so in those cases, how much attention can I really be paying to either task? As an adult engaging in recreational activities, my multitasking has limited consequences, unless you count me having to keep asking my husband, wait, what happened? More often than not, he missed it too, though. He's usually puttering around on his laptop while we watch TV. But adolescents who are trying to learn academic material have much more real dangers from multitasking. A recent study of 8 to 18-year-old American students found that two-thirds engage in several media activities at once. For every 15 minutes of studying, they engaged in some sort of media diversion, an average of 6 times. And multitasking actually changes the type of learning that occurs. Focusing on one task activates explicit memory, which involves conscious strategic recall and enables new information to be used flexibly and adaptively in contexts outside the original learning situation. On the other hand, multitasking prompts implicit memory, which is a shallower and more automatic form of learning. Researchers have long been concerned about multitasking behaviors as they pertain to learning, finding them to be associated with a variety of poor learning outcomes, such as problems with executive function, higher levels of distraction, and less thorough learning. A recent meta-analysis actually found that media multitasking interferes with attention and working memory, negatively affecting GPA, Test performance, recall, reading comprehension, note taking, self regulation, and efficiency. Perhaps more concerning than the effects themselves is the fact that teens are so disregarding of them. Ever hear a teenager tell you, "No, I learned better with the TV on"? In fact, that's not true. Students struggle to accurately assess the impact that media multitasking will have on their academic performance, which makes it extra difficult to get them to stop doing it, even though we know that they should. So that's the end of our conversation for this week. Next week, we will dive into the social and emotional overhaul that occurs during adolescence.